Good morning, everybody. Go ahead and jump on in. I'm going to give all of our friends about a minute or so to hop on. So just go ahead and sit tight and enjoy this little view of our park. And we will get started in about a minute. All right, I'm going to give everybody another 30 seconds or so, and then we're going to get started with our program. So just sit tight for just a little bit longer. Just want to make sure everybody has a chance to hop on before we get going. All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our History of Cinco de Mayo program here at Columbia State Historic Park. My name is Caleb Mascalier, and I work for California State Parks, like it says right here on my patch. And Columbia State Historic Park is one of the 280 state parks in California, and we happen to be an old gold mining town. And we're going to explore a little bit of Colombia history today. We are going to explore the history of Cinco de Mayo. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to do before we dive into this program. The first thing is I'm going to do a quick little 360 here to show y'all where I am at in the park. And it is quite a nice day today. It's going to be nice and sunny, and I think it might end up being around 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the park here today. And Colombia is an actual place that you can visit. We are still a living, breathing town. And I want to show y'all where Colombia is now on planet Earth. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And I'm going to share my screen a few times today. And when I do that, it might turn sideways for just a second. So there we go. There is planet Earth. And we're going to fly on over to Colombia. Now, Colombia is located in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And the foothills is where our gold miners rushed to starting in 1848. From 1848 to about 1856, 300,000 people rushed to California from all around the world, from every continent but Antarctica. And these 300,000 people all rushed here because they had the same idea. They had heard that there was free gold, free wealth, free money lying in the ground. So they undertook some dangerous journeys to come here to California, hoping to have the opportunity to try to strike it rich quick and take that newfound wealth back home to their families. And now I'm going to bring up Google Maps so I can show y'all. And Colombia is the first recorded place in the United States to have celebrated Cinco de Mayo. That's what our program is about today. We're going to look at some of the history of Cinco de Mayo. Now, something very important that I want to get done first is to let everybody know that Cinco de Mayo is not actually Mexico's Independence Day. That is in September. The holiday of Cinco de Mayo is celebrating a victory at the Battle of Puebla, which we'll go over that a little bit later. But I want you to be thinking about, oh, hang on just a second, friends. Sorry about that. I had to sneeze. Didn't want to sneeze in your ears. I'm going to apologize now. If I have to do that a couple of times, my allergies are bugging me today. So if I mute and go off screen for a little bit, that's what I'm doing. But I want you all to be thinking about Cinco de Mayo as an American Civil War holiday that was started by the Latino community here in California to celebrate the victory of the Battle of Puebla, but also to celebrate democracy and freedom. Now, before we dive into Cinco de Mayo, we're going to pull ourselves back to the 1840s, or even earlier than that. And I'm going to show y'all another map, which I hope y'all like maps today. Now, before California was part of, or before California was part of the United States, it was part of Mexico. So here is a map from 1824. California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, even parts of Idaho were all part of Mexico. The place I am in now would have been called Alta California in 1824. So this right here is a map of the Republic of Mexico. Then if we fast forward to 1836, the area that is now the state of Texas decided that they no longer wanted to be part of the Mexican Republic, so they declared their own independence. They had a little war there, and eventually Texas would become part of the United States. Now, fast forward to 1846. We're going to zoom in a little bit. So you see that area with the 14 free states, and then we also have the 15 slave states in the South, so the states that still allowed slavery. And we have this little area here that is part of Texas as well that was in dispute between the United States and the Mexican Republic. And then over here on the left, we have the Republic of Mexico. And you can see its territory was part of California, or California was part of its territory. Now, I'm going to ask y'all a question, and you can turn to a neighbor and tell them. Shortly after this little map here, we see it when it was made in 1846. Around that time, there was a war that was started. And go ahead and see if you can think of the name of the war. And I'll tell you in a second. I'll give you 30 seconds. And if you want to tell your neighbor what you think this war was called. All right, 15 more seconds. We're almost done. And 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, so the name of this war was the Mexican-American War. It was started in 1846. President James Polk decided that he was going to send American soldiers over there to take some of the territory. They had a disagreement. So a war was started over this disagreement. The war didn't last very long. It would last till November of 1847. That's when the fighting would stop. It was a very short war. The United States won it, and they would eventually, and by they I mean the United States, would eventually take control of California, Oregon, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Wyoming, and Colorado. That was a huge territory. And that would take place in February of 1848 when they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States also paid the Mexican government $15 million for those territories. Now, between when the fighting stopped in November of 1848 and in February of, sorry, when the fighting stopped in November of 1847 and when the treaty was signed in February of 1848, something happened. And this happened in January. So I want you to turn to your neighbor and tell them what happened in January of 1848. It was pretty important. Does anybody think they know? If you think you know, give me the little thumbs up emoji. I'm seeing some emojis there. So give me thumbs up if you think you know what happened in January of 1848. Ah, I see some of you do. Well, what happened in January of 1848 was that Mr. James Marshall, an employee of John Sutter, officially discovered gold at John Sutter's mill, which is now the city of Coloma. It's farther north from Columbia. But that started the gold rush. That's what caused these 300,000 people to rush to California. Now, we already had other people living here in California. The first people that were living here, I'm going to flip my camera around too, were the Native Americans. Now, the Native Americans that live in the Columbia area are the Central Sierra Miwok. And if you're wondering why I'm showing you this little road through Columbia, well, this was one of their trails used for thousands of years. The people of Columbia actually built the main street on top of an old Miwok trail, and we use it today as our main street. And there were roughly 300,000 Native Americans living in California before the gold rush started. But there were also a lot of Mexican citizens living here. They were called Californios. And when the treaty was signed in February of 1848, they became US citizens overnight and they stayed here. They had a lot of the ranches and farms already here in California. And once they noticed all of these people rushing to California for the gold, they would eventually go up into the foothills themselves. Now, gold here in Colombia wasn't officially discovered till about 2 years after Mr. James Marshall did. And I say officially because the Native Americans did know about the gold here in California. They just didn't mine it because, well, they didn't really have a use for it. They didn't put the same value that Americans and Europeans do on it. They used other items like shells as money. So they knew about the gold. And I just want to clarify that when I say officially. Now, these rocks, if you're wondering why you're looking at these rocks right now, this is one of the spots that was mined for gold here in Colombia. And it might be hard to see, but if you look through those trees, there's a little street right back there where my finger is. There used to be a stream there before the gold rush. This entire place looked way different before the California gold rush. The gold miners completely changed the landscape of California here. Now, that little seasonal stream right over there is where gold was officially discovered in California, or in Colombia, I mean. And it was discovered by the Hildreth Party. Now, the Hildreth Party was led here by Dr. Thaddeus Hildreth, and they were traveling through the area here. And there were likely a lot of California miners already in this area. We have a city near us called Sonora. At one point, Sonora's population was half Hispanic. That's why its name is Sonora. It's named after the Sonora state of Mexico. So they were already in this area, and it was pretty likely that they were mining here. And our California miners, they tended to be quiet about when they found gold. So that's why there weren't many people here. Then the Hildreth Party comes wandering through one day and sees them at that stream. They wander up to the stream to try to gold mine, and likely remembering the results of the Mexican-American War, the Californios that were here just decided to make themselves scarce, and they walked away from the stream. And the Hildreth Party, they did find a lot of gold. One of their members, John Walker, panned for gold. Now, they did something that our Mexican, Chilean, and Peruvian miners wouldn't do. Go ahead and think for a second, and if you want to tell one of your neighbors, what do you think the Hildreth Party did that was different? All right. I'm going to go ahead and tell you what they did. They told somebody. You see, most of our Mexican, Chilean, and Peruvian miners, they would keep quiet when they found gold. They would be very quiet. They didn't tend to tell a lot of people. But the Hildreth party was different. They decided they wanted to brag that they found gold. They told somebody, and within 3 weeks, an area that didn't have a very large permanent population had about 4 to 5,000 miners crowded around this little stream. And I'm going to show you now some of the tools that our American and European miners would have used while they were crowded around that stream. Just let me get my camera set up here. All right. So this first little tool that you are looking at, that little wooden looking box, is called a rocker box. You can also call it a cradle because our gold miners thought it was kind of like a little bit like a baby cradle. And I want you to think of this like a gigantic gold pan. Our miners, they had gold pans as well. You shovel dirt on top of this, and rocking it back and forth like this, well, it breaks it apart. But you see, I still have the dirt right there. I want the dirt to go away. The gold is in the dirt, and I want all of that dirt to get washed out. So how do we do that? Well, we dump lots and lots of water on it. This thing doesn't really work without water. So you need to shovel dirt on it, dump water on it as someone's rocking it and breaking it apart. And all of that mud flows out the bottom here. And our gold miners, they're not really worried about losing the gold because, well, it's heavier than water. So it'll sink to the bottom. I'm going to take us for a closer look at this little rocker box here. So they would shovel the gold into this spot, and they would look in this little area to see if they could find gold because those are some decent sized holes. A nugget that didn't fall through that would be worth a lot of money. But most of the gold would have been caught on this little piece of canvas here, or as you can see, all of that dirt there in between those little things called riffles. And you would scoop the dirt out with this right here. I'm going to give you a second. Turn to your neighbor and tell them what you think this is. What do you think this little thing is that I'm holding? Almost every miner, no matter where they came from, would likely have something like this. This is called a great horn spoon. So if you've read the novel by the Great Horn Spoon, this is the Great Horn Spoon right here. You would use it to scoop the dirt out the riffles, and then you're going to put it in your gold pan. Now, all of this mining required lots and lots of water, but we didn't have a permanent supply here yet. So I want you all to turn to your neighbor and go ahead and tell your neighbor, what do you think our American and European miners would do in the summertime when there's no water here in Colombia? So we're completely out of water. What are we to do? All right, I'm going to give you a clue from some popular answers I've gotten before. You couldn't spit in it because, well, you don't have enough spit to fill up that rocker box or even a gold pan. And we couldn't store water because it would already dry up or we would have used it already. And well, we couldn't dig a well because it's way too deep. So I'll give you a few more seconds. What do you think they would do? All right, let me give you another clue. I'm going to ask you another question. Is Colombia the only gold rush town in California? And do you think the miners had to stay here year round? They didn't. So most of our miners would actually leave the town of Columbia during the summertime when they didn't have water because the Americans and Europeans only knew how to gold mine with water. And the type of mining that we have here is called placer mining. Placer miners just dig through the dirt in the ground. Everywhere where we will be walking today, at some point was mined for gold. So most of our miners would leave. That is, except our Mexican, Chilean, and Peruvian miners, because, well, they knew how to placer mine without water. You see, many of them were already experienced from a gold rush in the country of Chile. They knew how to dry mine. And I'm going to show you some of those techniques. The first one is if you were a single miner, you could use a basket like this or a wooden bowl. You can use your great horn spoon. You're going to fill it with dirt. And then you know what you do? You got to shake it back and forth. And then you got to toss it up in the air, and then you got to shake it back and forth and toss it up in the air. And you got to shake it back and forth and toss it in the air. And there's a lot of shaking back and forth and tossing in the air. We normally have a nice breeze through here, which would blow all of that dust away. So this is probably a dusty job. But we're also not worried about the gold floating away because it's nice and heavy. And it'll float right back into your basket or your bowl. And I'm going to show y'all another technique, a bigger version of that. Since we had a pretty large Hispanic population in California, many of them would work together. And what you would get is a couple people digging through the dirt with shovels and pickaxes. Then you would need some people with a blanket. So we're going to do something here real quick. So everybody stretch out a little bit, make sure there's enough room. And I'm going to grab one side of the invisible blanket, and I want you to grab the other side. All right, everybody got a good hold of the invisible blanket? Our friends put a lot of dirt on it, so we got to toss the dirt up. All right, got to toss that dirt up. Whew, they put a lot of dirt on here. We got to keep going. All right, a couple more tosses. 1, 2. All right. So that technique that we just practiced is called winnowing. And I'm going to show y'all a nice little picture of some winnowing now. This is what it would have looked like. There we go. There is some of our winnowing right there. And this is something that the Mexican, Chilean, and Peruvian miners knew about. Most of the miners from the United States or Europe didn't really learn this technique. And this technique was very popular in the Colombia area. We are what's called the southern mines. And they really, really like the southern mines because they tended to be drier than the other ones. So they were successful at finding gold here year round. And I want to show y'all what some of the gold would have looked like. But oh, before I do that, I almost forgot this other technique. This one's also important. And this is one that our miners from the US and Europe would eventually use here in Colombia quite a bit. This funny looking little pit thing that's got wood around it and rocks lining it is called an arrastra. It's used to grind up quartz. And I'll show you some quartz here in a second. But you would grind up the quartz with another rock. And you would normally have a donkey or a burro walking in a circle, grinding this up. It's kind of the same idea as grinding up some wheat. And they would have lots of these here in Colombia. So I'm going to show y'all some quartz now. So this is what they were looking for. And this is always a good sign too, whenever you're gold mining. Gold here in the Sierra Nevada mountains comes in and around quartz. So if it's in the quartz and we want to get it right out of this piece of quartz, we have to grind it up. Because most of the gold found here would have looked something similar to this. Now, this is gold shavings, so it's paper thin, but it's about the size and shape of the gold you would have found here in Colombia. It's called gold dust, those little specks and flakes. And they would find a lot of it. That's why Colombia was such a huge city. They would find an estimated $87 million worth of gold just in the town of Colombia during the gold rush. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 160 tons. That is a lot of gold. That's why so many people came here and stayed here searching for gold. So that quickly was some of the gold mining techniques, and the Arastra was very important and a big contribution for our gold miners here, not just for our Mexican, Chilean, and Peruvian miners, but for all the miners here, because many of them would eventually start using those Arastras to help them find the gold. All right, we're going to move on to something else now, since we're done with our gold mining demonstration here. So, for the first few years of the gold rush, like the first 2 or 3 or so, roughly half the population was Hispanic. Now, there wasn't a huge population here in California yet. That would come later on by 1856. We would have those 300,000 people rush here. But roughly half the population was Hispanic. Now, something that our Mexican and Chilean miners especially did that was different than our miners from the US or Europe was that they brought their families here with them. Most of our American and European miners were young men, and they would leave their families in their hometown and they would come out here and be on their own for the first time. Most of our Mexican and Chilean miners, however, would actually bring their families up here with them. And they would build a little bit more permanent structures than most of our miners. Most of our American miners lived in tents. The Mexican and Chilean miners would start building more wooden structures and forming towns that way. Now, because they stayed here, the Mexicans and Chileans had a huge impact on California's constitution. Now, when the United States acquired California in 1848, it wasn't a state yet. It was still a territory. And I'm going to walk us to our next stop while I explain this. So California was a territory, not a state yet, and it didn't become a state for nearly 2 years, not till September of 1850. That's a really long time at that point for another place to become a state. And that has a lot to do with some of the politics that were going on then. You see, Congress was arguing whether or not California would be admitted into the Union, into the United States, as a free state, so no slavery, or a slave state, that they would allow slavery. And they would argue for about 2 years. And thanks to the contributions and the help of our Californios, California was eventually admitted into the United States as a free state. The Californios had a heavy influence on the first California state constitution. One of the big things is they based it on Mexican common law, which prohibited slavery and indentured servitude, except in the case of a punishment for a crime, which is still in the California Constitution today. That meant California was admitted into the United States as a free state. But because of our California's heavy influence on the Constitution, the first Constitution was actually written in Spanish as well as English. And many people would speak Spanish or English here in California. The main street that we were just on, it was said that if you walked through it during the gold rush, you would hear 10 different languages spoken. But many people would learn at least partly a second language, and the two languages that were the most common for someone to learn as a second language were English or Spanish. Now, Mexican common law also influenced some other laws that would be passed later on in California. And these were important, and that's why I brought us over to this house here called the Martinez house. Now, Elisa Martinez was a property owner, and she also owned a gold mine here in Colombia, or rather, just outside of town. She was a very wealthy woman. And this is important because in other spots in the United States, women were not allowed to own and operate businesses. So I'll just give you an example. Let's say we are in the state of Maine during the gold rush, and if you were married and the woman's husband died, well, she would have 6 months, or she would have to sell the business and give the money to her husband's nearest male relative. Well, California was different, and that was due in part to our California's influence. They didn't get it in the state constitution, but they did get a law passed in 1852 called the Sole Trader Act. This was very important. It said that a married woman could come here to California and could own and operate her own business. She could actually own it and run it herself, like Elisa Martinez did. So California was one of the first places to allow women to run businesses, and we had many women business owners here in the town of Columbia. So those are just some of the contributions there for the gold mining, our Hispanic miners. They gave us winnowing and the Arastra. They helped influence the California Constitution by helping us become a free state and also helping the Sole Trader Act get passed. So now we are going to jump forward in time. We are going to jump forward to April 12th, sorry, 1861. That is when the United States entered the Civil War. We had a war with ourselves. Our country divided into two, into the Union and Confederacy, and it ended up being the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. Over 800,000 people would die in that conflict. And that started on April 12th, 1861. A few months after that had started, the French Empire invaded Mexico. This happened on December 8th, 1861. And you don't really have to remember these dates. Now, right before all of this had happened, Mexico, like many young countries, needed to borrow money. The United States had to do this too. And they had borrowed money from the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, and the French Empire. And the president at the time, Benito Juarez, had said that he needed to stop making loan payments for a little bit because this money they borrowed was a loan. Well, those three empires didn't like it very much, so they marched. They sent multiple armies and marched on the Mexican capital to get them to reinstate the loan payments. And the United States thought about stopping it. We have something called the Monroe Doctrine that said that all of those other European countries, well, they had to stay out of North America. There wasn't any more colonizing coming from them. They had to stay on the other side of the ocean. That if they came here, they would have to deal with the United States. So to make sure that the French Empire and the British Empire and the Spanish Empire, they didn't want to get in a war with the United States. They let the United States know they were only collecting a loan payment. And that was true of the British and Spanish empires. After they got them to reinstate the loans, they left. But the French Empire, they didn't do that. They waited till after we entered into the Civil War, and they then invaded Mexico because they thought that, well, the Mexican Republic with their freedom and letting people vote, well, that was barbaric, and they needed to be back under the monarchy, under an emperor. So they decided to free Mexico and bring them back under the emperor. And that began in December of 1861. And during that time, in the American Civil War, the United States was losing battle after battle. After the French Empire invaded Mexico, they also started losing battle after battle. So this was a very dark time. And even here in California, they were hearing about all of this news. All the Californios here were hearing about the bad news from both sides. And the Confederacy had also sent agents over to try to rob all of the gold shipments. California's biggest contribution to the United States during the Civil War was the gold shipments. We still had gold mining here that was continually shipped back east to help fund the war effort. So the Confederacy sent people out here to try to stop it or rob it. So this was a very dark time. These people were seeing all of these bad things that were happening. And finally, there was a little light of hope. And that little light of hope, well, it happened on May 5th, 1862. And I'm going to show you all a picture of it now. And this is why we celebrate Cinco de Mayo now. It is from the Battle of Puebla. Now, from a military standpoint, the Mexican army should have lost this battle. They were completely outgunned, completely outnumbered, and they didn't even have some of the equipment that the French Empire did. But they made a brave stand. Here's a little painting of what the battle might have looked like. And it was a pretty long battle that occurred. But by the end of it, the Mexican army had defeated the French army at the Battle of Puebla. And the French army that they defeated was an army that had not known defeat. They had not lost a battle in 50 years. So this was embarrassing for the French Emperor, Napoleon III, because Napoleon had sent over 10,000 soldiers into Mexico to try to conquer them. Now, also, while Napoleon was doing this, while the Battle of Puebla was going on, he had been talking with the Confederacy to try to join them, which could have changed the outcome of the American Civil War. Many historians believe that the Battle of Puebla also changed the course of that because Napoleon III, well, he was kind of mad that his undefeated army just got beat by a bunch of ragtag people. So instead of sending 30,000 soldiers to the Confederacy to aid them in fighting the United States, he sent the 30,000 soldiers to Mexico. Now, this victory, there would be a few other victories, but eventually the Mexican Republic would actually lose this war. The fighting would continue until June of 1867. But not all hope was lost. The French army sending their soldiers there to fight Mexico eventually allowed the United States to win the American Civil War. After the United States finished its Reconstruction, it decided to help Benito Juarez. You remember that little Monroe Doctrine I told you about earlier? That it said if European powers came and tried to colonize parts of the North American continent, they would have to deal with the United States. Well, now that we became a whole country again, we helped Benito Juarez. We gave him money and weapons that allowed him to retake the Mexican Republic back from the French. Now, when we go back to May 5th of 1862, that dark time that was occurring, especially here in California, the news would reach the Californios here roughly 3 weeks later. The Latino community here was excited. This was a little light in the darkness. So they decided to celebrate. They threw a party. They fired their guns into the air. They had dancing, music. They had impromptu speeches celebrating freedom and democracy. And the first recorded place in the United States to have done that was right here in Colombia. They threw a big party. And that's really what Cinco de Mayo is about this little battle. And it's to celebrate freedom, democracy, and the victory at the Battle of Puebla in what was a very dark time in US history here. So I want you all to be thinking about, again, that Cinco de Mayo is really an American Civil War holiday that was started by the Latino community to help celebrate freedom and democracy after the victory at the Battle of Puebla. And I'm standing here kind of in the middle of the town. You can see we have some decorations up here because we still to this day celebrate Cinco de Mayo here. And if you are able to, I want to invite every one of you to come here and celebrate Cinco de Mayo in the first place it was celebrated in the United States. And that will be this Saturday and Sunday. And it's actually free to come and walk around the town during that time. And we are going to try to celebrate as close as we can in the fashion that our Latino community did here back in 1862. So I hope you all enjoyed this brief little look into the history of Cinco de Mayo and some of the big contributions of our Latino community here to gold mining and California as a whole. So I want to thank y'all again for coming. I hope you enjoyed this, and I do hope that I can actually see you here one day in Columbia State Historic Park. And before I let you go, I'm going to do another little 360 just to kind of show you the town a little bit more. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. And I hope everybody has an awesome day and a happy Cinco de Mayo. Bye, everybody.